There is a sentence Mark Carney said publicly that almost nobody in American media stopped to fully process. We should no longer send 3/4 of our defense capital spending to America. Read that again. The sitting Prime Minister of Canada, America's closest ally, its largest trading partner, the country that shares the longest undefended border on Earth, stood at a podium and told the world that Canada was done financing American defense dominance with Canadian money. That was not a slip. That was not frustration talking. That was a declaration. And what followed it over the next 12 months quietly reshaped the entire military and strategic architecture of the Western Alliance in ways Washington is still working to fully understand. This is that story, and almost nobody has told it completely. There is a moment that almost nobody covered the way it deserved to be covered. Not a press conference, not a summit, not a dramatic diplomatic rupture. Just a quiet notification from Brussels that Canada would not be included in a key preliminary NATO planning session. No official statement, no explanation beyond the routine. Scheduling overlap, limited seats, internal restructuring. In Washington, it barely registered. In Ottawa, it was understood immediately for exactly what it was. Not a mistake, a message. Because the session Canada was excluded from was not ordinary administration. It was a preliminary defense alignment discussion focused on NATO's evolving Article 3 expectations. The part of the alliance that almost never makes the news but quietly determines credibility before collective defense is even considered. It is where members assess each other's ability to sustain independent defense capacity. It is where priorities are set, where future funding and procurement standards begin to take shape, where influence begins to shift before anyone announces that it has. And the topics being discussed without Canada in the room were not abstract. Arctic surveillance readiness, northern maritime control, long-term air defense compatibility across allied forces. These are not peripheral issues for Canada. They sit at the absolute core of its strategic identity inside NATO. The conversation about Canada's role in all of it was happening without Canada present. Washington viewed this as leverage, a quiet reminder about burden sharing. For years, the Trump administration had increasingly framed NATO participation in transactional terms. Countries that met spending expectations were protected, countries that did not were questioned. Canada was often used as the example, a partner benefiting from a system it did not fully finance at the level Washington demanded. That narrative had been building for months. The exclusion from the planning session did not start it, it simply made it visible. Ottawa's interpretation was completely different. This was not about budgets, this was about positioning. If Canada could be left out of preparatory defense discussions today, then tomorrow it could be shaped without input. Not through force, through design, through standards set elsewhere and later applied to Canada as a condition of participation. That realization forced a shift in thinking, quiet, careful, and deliberately invisible to public view. Because reacting publicly would only reinforce the message Washington wanted to send, that Canada would always be reactive, always dependent on American decisions, always inside a frame set by others. So instead of confrontation, there was preparation, and then a phone call. Not to Washington, across the Atlantic. Most people had never paid close attention to the relationship between Ottawa and Berlin. For decades, it existed quietly in the background. G7 meetings, trade forums, diplomatic courtesy, nothing that shaped the larger architecture of Western power. That changed the moment Mark Carney became Prime Minister. Under Chancellor Friedrich Merz, Germany was no longer behaving like a cautious middle power waiting for consensus. It was behaving like a state preparing to shape it. Defense spending had expanded at levels not seen since the Cold War. Military procurement strategy was being restructured around long-term independence. And most importantly, Berlin had begun coordinating more directly with European partners outside traditional dependency on American-led frameworks. For Ottawa, this was not symbolic. It was an opening, a different access point into global defense architecture. Not a replacement for NATO, not an exit from the United States, something more subtle, an alternative channel of coordination that did not require Washington's permission to exist. When Carney's call reached Berlin, it did not begin with complaint or protest. It began with alignment. What followed was confirmed through multiple public announcements that most American coverage barely mentioned. The two leaders met in person at the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta in June 2025. They met again at the Canada-EU summit in Brussels, then again in Berlin in August 2025, where trade, security, energy, and defense industrial capacity topped the agenda. Then again in a trilateral call with Norway's Prime Minister in May 2026, directly focused on NATO summit priorities. 4 meetings in 12 months between the Canadian Prime Minister and the German Chancellor. That is not routine diplomacy. That is architecture. And while those meetings were happening, something else was being built in parallel, something that went far beyond bilateral conversations. Now here is where the story stops being about phone calls and starts being about real power. Because while all of this was happening quietly behind closed doors, Mark Carney was simultaneously doing something that directly targeted the assumption Washington had held about Canada for decades. The assumption was simple. Canada needed American defense spending more than America needed Canada. That dependency kept Ottawa close, manageable, and predictable. Always inside the frame, always responding to American priorities, always spending Canadian money inside American systems. Then Carney stood at the University of Toronto and said out loud what Washington had never expected a Canadian Prime Minister to say publicly. We should no longer send 3/4 of our defense capital spending to America. That sentence carried consequences that are still unfolding, because it was not just rhetoric. It came with a plan, a specific, documented, financially committed plan. Canada committed to meeting NATO's 2% GDP defense spending target 5 years ahead of schedule. That alone was significant. But then Carney went further. Canada agreed to the new NATO target of 5% of GDP by 2035, a commitment that would eventually require roughly $150 billion annually. Canada had not spent that proportion of its economy on defense since the 1950s. But the number that truly mattered was not the total, it was the direction. Carney made explicitly clear that the new spending would not flow primarily to American defense contractors. It would flow toward new submarines, new aircraft, new ships, armed vehicles, Arctic radar systems, drone technology, and seafloor monitoring sensors. And increasingly, it would flow toward European partners. In February 2026, Canada became the first non-European country to join the EU's Security Action for Europe initiative, unlocking billions in market access for Canadian defense industries. In June 2025, Canada and the EU signed a comprehensive security and defense partnership. Canada signed a new strategic partnership with Poland covering defense, aviation, cybersecurity, and clean energy. Canada announced it would be the lead country at a major defense industry expo in Poland the following year. In 12 months, Canada had quietly inserted itself into the core of European defense industrial architecture, not as a buyer, as a partner, as a supplier, as a country with strategic resources, aerospace capacity, and critical minerals that Europe desperately needed and was now actively building relationships to secure. And Washington was no longer the center of that calculation. Here is the detail that changes everything, and I want you to pay close attention because this is the part almost every analyst covering this story has missed entirely. In May 2026, Mark Carney became the first non-European leader ever invited to attend a meeting of the European political community. Read that carefully. Not a NATO summit, not a G7, not a bilateral meeting, the European political community, a forum that by design and by definition had never included a non-European head of government, until Canada. Speaking in Armenia at a summit on the future of Europe, Carney said the international order could be rebuilt out of Europe. He said Ottawa was interested in deepening relations with reliable partners. He called for different coalitions for different issues based on common values and interests. He explicitly mentioned Canadian cooperation with the Nordic-Baltic 8 to secure NATO's northern and western flanks. And then he said something that deserves to be heard very carefully. We are no longer just relying on the strength of our values, but also the value of our strength. That sentence was not delivered in Ottawa, it was not delivered in Washington, it was delivered in Armenia, to a room full of European leaders at a summit Canada had never before been invited to attend. That is not a coincidence. That is a signal. And the question is whether Washington fully understands yet what it is a signal of. Now let me tell you what Washington sees when it looks at all of this together. Because individually, each piece of this story sounds manageable. A meeting here, a spending commitment there, a defense partnership signed somewhere in Europe. But when you pull back and look at the pattern across 12 months, what emerges is not incremental diplomacy. What emerges is structural repositioning. Canada has not left NATO. Canada has not withdrawn from NORAD. Canada has not severed intelligence sharing with the United States. Every formal alliance structure remains intact on paper. But Canada has done something far more consequential than break a formal structure. It has demonstrated that its defense future can include more than one center of gravity. And in international systems built on assumed centrality, that demonstration is often the beginning of everything changing. Think about what has actually shifted in 12 months. Canada is now a member of the EU's Security Action for Europe initiative. Canadian defense companies can now bid on contracts inside Europe's massive Rearm Europe program. Canada has signed strategic defense partnerships with Germany, Poland, and multiple European nations. Canada is meeting NATO's spending target years ahead of schedule, and Canada has explicitly stated it will redirect that spending away from American contractors. Each of those facts, taken alone, sounds like responsible alliance management. Together, they represent a profound recalibration of where Canadian defense capital flows, where Canadian industrial relationships are built, and where Canadian political influence is being cultivated. Washington spent years assuming that Canada's defense dependency was so deep, so structural, so operationally embedded that it functioned as a permanent anchor. That assumption was not wrong. It was simply not permanent. Because here is what Mark Carney understood that Washington appears to have underestimated. Dependency is not fixed. It is a product of available alternatives. And for decades, Canada's alternatives were limited not because Europe was unwilling, but because Canada had not seriously pursued them. The moment Canada began seriously pursuing them, everything changed. So where does this actually go? Let me give you 3 things to watch in the weeks and months ahead. First, the NATO summit. The next major NATO gathering will define how far the new defense spending framework actually reaches. Watch specifically whether Canada secures a meaningful role in Arctic defense planning, the exact domain it was excluded from in that early preliminary session. If Canada enters that summit with European backing and exits with a formal Arctic coordination role, the exclusion that started this story will have produced exactly the opposite of what Washington intended. Second, the fighter aircraft decision. Canada's review of its fighter fleet has introduced real uncertainty into long-standing procurement assumptions. The possibility that Canada diversifies away from existing American platforms or negotiates European participation into its fighter strategy would be one of the most concrete signals yet that the repositioning is not just diplomatic language, it is industrial reality. Third, the defense spending trajectory. Canada has committed to 5% of GDP by 2035. That is roughly $150 billion per year. Watch where that money actually goes. Every contract signed with a European aerospace firm instead of an American one is a data point. And data points accumulated over years become the new architecture. Here is the honest question nobody is asking loudly enough. What happens to American leverage over Canadian foreign policy decisions if Canada successfully reduces its defense dependency on the United States from 3/4 to something meaningfully lower over the next decade? That question does not have a clean answer today, but the fact that it is now being asked at all inside Washington's own policy circles tells you something important about how this moment is being read by the people who think about these things for a living. Canada did not break anything. Canada did not exit anything. Canada did not even formally challenge anything. It simply stopped behaving the way it was expected to behave. And in international systems built on assumptions, that is often the most powerful move of all. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because this story is not over, not even close. And the next move could come at any moment.